Today we're talking about stamp duty, and before we get into it, a small warning. If you're a homeowner who's been stung by a large stamp duty bill or a first-time buyer who's currently watching their savings get eaten up before they even get the keys, some of what I'm about to cover may raise your blood pressure a little, so you have been warned. This is a touchy subject. It touches everyone who buys property in this country and it generates strong opinions. So I want to do this properly, because it's a topic that gets a lot of noise but not much depth. You'll often hear people say stamp duty is too high or it should be reformed, but they rarely explain why it works the way it does or how we got here. So that's what we're going to do today. We're going to go through the history, look at the moments where changes to stamp duty actually shifted the market, and then I'm going to tell you exactly what I think needs to happen and why I believe it would genuinely help people get on and move up the housing ladder. If you haven't subscribed yet, please do. I put out a weekly market update every Friday, and content like this when there's something worth digging into properly. So let's get into it. Stamp duty has been around for a very long time. We're talking 1694, the reign of William and Mary. It was introduced to fund a war against France. A temporary tax, obviously, and as any of us who have ever been taxed on something will recognise, once a government finds something that raises money reliably, it tends to stick around. For most of its history, stamp duty on property was fairly modest. Through most of the 1980s and into the 1990s, buyers either paid nothing at all or 1% if the price exceeded a relatively low threshold. For a lot of ordinary buyers, it simply wasn't a significant factor in the transaction. That started to change in 1997 when New Labour came to power and introduced what's known as the slab system. Different rates applied to different price bands, and the jump between price bands was sudden and steep. Pay one rate on the whole purchase price right up to a threshold, then cross that threshold by a single pound, and the entire price was taxed at the higher rate. That created what people in the industry called cliff edges. Dead zones in the market where very few transactions took place because no buyer in their right mind would pay a penny over a threshold if they could avoid it. The distortion was worst around £250,000, where the rate jumped from 1% to 3% overnight on the whole price. Not just the proportion above £250,000, the whole lot. And once governments realised how much revenue the slab system generated, they were reluctant to touch it. It stayed broadly unchanged for the best part of 2 decades. In December 2003, stamp duty land tax, what we now call SDLT, formally replaced the old stamp duty on property. The principle was similar, but the administration changed. It moved to a self-assessment system where buyers are responsible for calculating and paying the tax administered through HMRC. The rates and the slab structure largely stayed. The nil rate threshold at that point was £60,000, which tells you something about where house prices were at the time and how much they've moved since. Through the 2000s, the government nudged thresholds upwards incrementally. The nil rate moving to £125,000 in 2006 and sitting there for years. And the top rate crept up over time too, reaching 5% on properties over £1 million in 2011, then 7% on anything over £2 million in 2012. All of that was layering more cost onto the market. But the fundamental problem, the slab structure with its cliff edges and distortions, remained. Now, it's worth pausing on 2008 because it shows how governments reach for stamp duty as a market lever when things go wrong. When the financial crisis hit and the housing market fell off a cliff, the government temporarily raised the nil rate threshold from £125,000 to £175,000 for 12 months, later extended it into 2009. The idea was to keep the lower end of the market moving and give buyers a bit of breathing room. Did it work? Partially. It kept some transactions going that might otherwise have stalled. But it was a short-term measure dealing with a short-term crisis and not a structural fix. And when it ended, the market absorbed the reversal without dramatic consequence, largely because prices had fallen enough to offset the additional cost. The lesson from 2008 is one we would see repeated later. Temporary relief creates urgency and brings forward transactions, but it doesn't fundamentally change anything once it's gone. The most important structural reform in the modern era of stamp duty happened in December 2014, when Chancellor George Osborne announced a shift from the slab system to what's called a slice system. From the 4th of December 2014, instead of paying one rate on the entire purchase price, you'd pay different rates on successive portions of the price. Exactly the same logic as income tax. The first £125,000 nothing, the portion up to £250,000 2%, up to £925,000 5%, and so on. The OBR estimated that around 98% of buyers would pay the same or less under the new system, and broadly that was true for buyers up to around £937. Above that level, bills actually went up significantly. For a property at £1 million, the stamp duty bill rose by nearly 50% overnight. It was a sensible reform, quite frankly. It removed the artificial cliff edges, it was fairer, and for most buyers it was cheaper, and the market welcomed it. But it didn't solve every problem, and the years that followed saw new layers added on top of the improved foundation, most of which made things more complicated and more expensive for specific groups of buyers. In April 2016, a 3% surcharge was introduced on top of the standard rates for anyone buying an additional residential property. Second homes, buy-to-let investments, holiday lets. If you already owned a home and were buying another, you paid standard rates plus 3% across the board. The policy intent was clear enough. The government wanted to make buy-to-let less attractive and free up more stock for owner-occupiers, particularly first-time buyers. And it did dampen activity, especially at the lower end of the buy-to-let market. But the unintended consequence, which landlords and industry professionals pointed out at the time, was that it also put some downward pressure on rental supply over the following years. That's a whole separate conversation about the Renters' Right Act and the direction of the private rental sector. But it's worth flagging here as a reminder that stamp duty changes always have knock-on effects, and they're not always the ones that the government intended. That surcharge has since risen from 3% to 5% as of October 2024. The most dramatic example of stamp duty being used as a market tool in recent history is the COVID holiday announced in July 2020. The threshold for paying stamp duty at all was raised to £500,000 on residential purchases. For a buyer spending £500,000, that was a saving of up to £15,000, and the market responded almost immediately. Transactions rose around 15% in August 2020 and over 20% in September. By the year to June 2021, overall transactions were up 19% compared to the previous 12 months. Properties in the £500,000 to £925,000 bracket saw monthly sales running around 47% above normal levels. It was, by any measure, a significant stimulus. But there's a darker side to that story. The rush to beat the deadline created a market that priced in the saving almost immediately. For many buyers, the stamp duty saving was absorbed by rising asking prices. The holiday helped some people, no question, but for others, it was effectively a transfer from buyer to seller. And when the holiday wound down in stages through 2021, completed transactions dropped 63% in July 2021 compared to the previous month. That's the cliff edge problem again, just at a macro level. You pull buyers forward in time, create a frenzy, and then the market falls off the edge when the deadline passes. The academic evidence, including research from the LSE, is fairly clear. Stamp duty is generally considered a bad tax. It creates friction, distorts the market, and penalises movement. The holiday demonstrated this more vividly than any research paper ever could. In September 2022, in Kwasi Kwarteng's infamous mini-budget, the nil rate threshold was temporarily raised from £125,000 to £250,000, and the first-time buyer threshold went from £300,000 to £425,000. These were framed as permanent at the time, though they were always time-limited in practice. On the 1st of April 2025, both reverted. The nil rate threshold for standard buyers halved back to £125,000. The first-time buyer threshold dropped from £425,000 back to £300,000, and that last one matters a lot. In London and the South East, £300,000 is not a comfortable nil rate threshold. It's a tax on aspiration for people who are already stretching to get onto the property ladder. And just last week, the Cross-Party Housing Committee published a report calling on the government to launch a formal consultation into alternatives to stamp duty by the end of 2026. That's significant. This is the political conversation finally starting to move. But consultations take time, and the market doesn't have that much patience right now. So here's what I think, and I've thought this for a long time. The housing market in this country is at genuine risk of stagnation. The uncertainty around interest rates, the economy, the cost of living is creating paralysis. Buyers are hesitating, chains are falling through, and stamp duty is the lever the government has the most direct control over. They want to act, this is where to start. First, and this is non-negotiable in my view, stamp duty for first-time buyers should be abolished entirely. Not raised, not temporarily suspended, abolished. The 300,000 nil rate threshold is meaningless for a significant portion of first-time buyers in London and the South East. The average London property price sits well above that, so a first-time buyer in the capital is already paying stamp duty from day one of their ownership journey. That is a tax on the first step of a ladder that people are already struggling to reach. We've had a Help to Buy scheme, shared ownership, the mortgage guarantee scheme, various forms of assistance, and all of them have had mixed results. But abolishing stamp duty for first-time buyers is clean, immediate, and it doesn't distort the market the way purchase subsidies do. It removes a cost barrier without inflating prices. Second, and I've long advocated for this, downsizers should not pay stamp duty at all. An older couple in a 4-bedroom family home who want to move to something smaller and more manageable should not face a tax bill of potentially £10,000 or £15,000 or more as the price of freeing up their property. That is the wrong incentive, and it's a market problem, not just a personal one. Research from Jackson Stop suggested that a stamp duty exemption for downsizers could unlock as many as 500,000 properties in a single year. Think about that. 500,000 additional family-sized homes potentially coming to market simply because we removed the financial barrier stopping people from making a move that they already want to make. The housing crisis in this country is partly a supply problem and partly a circulation problem. We have a lot of underoccupied homes. We have a lot of older homeowners who would like to move but can't justify the cost. A stamp duty exemption for downsizers doesn't just help those individuals. It changes the supply dynamic for everyone below them in the chain. The family who gets their 4-bedroom home, the first-time buyer who gets the old family semi, it ripples all the way down. On investors and landlords, the picture is more nuanced. I understand the political argument for the additional surcharge, and there are landlords who have absorbed costs and continued to invest. But the continued increases now at 5% on top of standard rates are pushing smaller investors out of the market at a time when rental supply is already tight. There's a reasonable case for a more proportionate approach, particularly for landlords who are genuinely adding supply to the rental market rather than reducing it. But that's a conversation that needs more nuance than it currently gets. Stamp duty was invented in 1694 to fund a war. It has outlasted every empire, every recession, every government that has promised to reform it, and every deadline that it was supposed to make simpler. It raises around £15 billion a year for the Treasury, and that's why governments are reluctant to touch it. But the cost of not touching it is a housing market that moves too slowly, a generation that can't get on the ladder, and older homeowners sitting in properties they've outgrown because the tax bill to move doesn't make financial sense. The Parliamentary Housing Committee published their report calling for a consultation on reform just last week. That's a start, but I'd like to see action, not consultation. Now, I want to be clear about something. Everything I've laid out today, abolishing stamp duty for first-time buyers, exempting downsizers, rethinking the surcharge for investors, these are my views. My personal take after 25 years of watching this market up close. They won't necessarily solve the problem. They may even create problems of their own that I haven't anticipated. Tax policy rarely lands exactly as it's intended, and I'm a mortgage broker, not the Chancellor, thankfully. But they are a start, and right now a start is what we need, because the alternative is more of the same. More paralysis, more hesitation, more people locked out of a market that should be working for them. So, I'd genuinely love to know what you think. Do you agree with any of this? Disagree? More importantly, what are your ideas? What would you do if you had the power to reform stamp duty? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. There are some really smart people who watch this channel, and I suspect a few of you have better ideas than the people currently sitting in Westminster. So, let's hear them. If you found this useful, please share it with someone who's thinking about buying or moving. And if you haven't already, please do subscribe. I'll see you on Friday for the weekly market update. Take care.